Welcome to part 2 of my Network Rail Inspection Train project, an OO gauge conversion of a standard class 153 into something a little bit different, but also with something extra, an onboard video camera streaming a driver's eye view of my layout over the Wi-Fi network, viewable on a smartphone or laptop. In part 1 I dealt with all the tech, a Raspberry Pi Zero running the MotionEye operating system, and the power supply, converting the track voltage for the onboard electronics, as well as recharging the battery. But in this section, I want to get on with the modelling, turning a standard Hornby 153 into one of the small fleet of video inspection units, with bespoke body modifications, specialist equipment, and distinctive livery. But first, let's take a look at the prototype and remind ourselves what we're talking about. My subject is 153376, spotted parked up at Willesden Junction. I had just finished my wagon cam project, and it was immediately clear that this was the obvious follow-up. So time to research more about it. And the obvious place for that, the internet, where I found loads of information and some really useful images. From these I compiled my own drawing of what I think is the latest version, showing the position of the generator vents and which other windows are blanked out. I also made a start on the livery, finding out the font used for the lettering and collecting together all the logos, in preparation for my handmade decals. You can find that drawing and the files for the decals on my website, paterpracticus.com. The direct link to the downloads page is in the description, where you will find this and several other of my projects, as a place for any supporting files, or any related information or content. By the time I finish this video, that should be a bit more complete, updated with any additional files I'm still working on, and as well as the PDF for the decals, I'll have a full set of STLs for the 3D printed parts. And it's the first of those that we come to now, with the blanks for the windows and the generator vents. As I've already done the development for these, you could just skip this bit of the video and download the finished files ready for printing, but if you do want to know what goes into them, keep watching. The 3D design is done in Tinkercad, and having taken the measurements from one of the existing windows, I've recreated the shape using rectangular blocks and cylinders, the measurements down to 0.1 of a millimetre. The rectangles overlap, leaving spaces in the corners, each filled with a cylinder, with a radius and depth to match the window void, all backed by another rectangular block, a little bit bigger on all sides. From testing I found out that the thickness isn't quite uniform, so I've got an extra block at the top, to angle the window blank ever so slightly. Then with everything grouped I can export as an STL, ready for slicing. As the name suggests, this turns my 3D shape into layers, each one 0.2mm thick. The layers are printed on top of each other, the print head moving up that exact amount each time, and as my window blank is pretty small, it doesn't take very long to get to the top. After slicing, my STL is now in G-code, ready for the printer. I'm relatively new to 3D printing, and my first generation Ender 3 Neo is very much at the budget end of things, but with a little bit of tweaking, both to the hardware and to the printer settings. Most of the time, I'm getting some pretty reasonable results, certainly good enough for this kind of thing. The surface does have some of the diagonal lines from the last print pass, so I will have to give it a sand to get it perfectly smooth. Rather more challenging are the generator vents, and even though my CAD is looking pretty good, we soon encounter some pretty serious issues when we come to slice. Even at super quality, we're still very much limited by the nozzle width, as it's actually only the thickness of the layers that's got any better, and we can clearly see from the preview that we're not getting any detail of the slats, so we're going to need a different approach. And this is what I've come up with, printing it vertically. Here we can take advantage of that 0.12mm layer thickness, and I've laboriously calculated the position of each slat so they exactly correspond to a layer, stepping backwards in sets of 3. At least that's the theory. Let's see how it works on the slicer. And with super quality selected, that layer width of 0.12mm now matches the thickness of each of the slats as we go up the model, repeating the set of steps for each, with 4 solid layers at the top. Once again, good in theory. But let's see how it goes in practice, as it's really going to stretch the capabilities of the printer. Perhaps for the best, the slats are actually at the back of the print, so rather than worrying about it as it goes, I'm just going to have to wait till the end to see how well it's worked. And I'm actually pretty pleased with that. I've got good definition on each of the slats, and just a little bit of wobble on a few. Nothing I can't clean up with a scalpel. Now for the frame, and I've gone back to my previous design. Just knocking out 2 square holes, very slightly bigger than my vent blocks, so they'll push in snugly. Just like the window blanks, we can go back to the standard settings, with a layer thickness of 0.2mm, which will be absolutely fine for our basic shape, and the lip around each vent, which is exactly 2 layers. Now with everything printed, it's cleanup time. The top surfaces of my blanks are nice and flat, but they do have some of the diagonal lines from the last layer printing, so I am going to have to give them a bit of a sand, starting with a 320 grit emery paper, laid flat on my surface, where I can gently rub my window blank. I'm not looking to take much of the surface off, just to level those lines, so I don't need much pressure at all, just a little patience. Then it's a case of repeating the process, using an ever finer grade of paper, and I'm finishing up with a 3000 grit, which is more like polishing than actually sanding, and you can see that my diagonal lines have now disappeared. So back to my 320 grit paper to start on the others, sanding each one until equally smooth, finishing up on the superfine paper. Now onto the frames for the generator vents. With that raised lip I can't actually sand these, but the quality of the print is actually fine, with any diagonal lines kept to a minimum, and any remaining unevenness will flatten out with the priming. The vent blocks also don't need much attention. I've already straightened up the wobblier bits of the slats with a scalpel, and most of the sides will be hidden by the frame, so I just want to give them a bit of a sand so the edges are nice and crisp. And once again, with my abrasive paper flat on the surface, I can gently sand each side, just making sure I don't twist the block as I do so. Then, after a final rub on the superfine paper, I can clear any PLA dust out of the vents themselves. With all 4 blocks prepared, we can get on with the assembly. We do need to remember which way up everything goes. That lip is at the top of the frame, and the slats of the vents do angle downwards. Individually, this is barely noticeable, but with the two side by side, they won't line up if one's upside down. An easy way to check if you lost track while sanding is that the bottoms are smoother than the tops, having been on the bed of the printer. The blocks just push into the frame, although the fit is quite snug, so depending on how well your print went, you may need to clean up the bottoms of the holes so the blocks push right to the back, and they're completely level with each other, with the same amount sticking out above the frame on both pairs. Now, even though we're only going to replace some of the windows with blanks, we'll need to take out all of the side windows in readiness for painting. Mostly they're easily accessible, but we will need to remove the cab at one end, carefully flexing the body shell to release the clips on either side, and easing the cab backwards, taking care not to interfere with the sprung connector wires for the directional lighting. We can also take out the strip of light insulation, putting it carefully to one side so it doesn't get lost. The front windows and plastic for the lights themselves can stay in place for now. But on with the side windows, some of which just falling out with the cab removed. By design, all the windows for each side are a continuous strip, with flexible bits between sections, presumably to make factory fitting easier. They also break really easily, which really isn't a problem, as long as we remember which one comes from where. But it is worth trying to keep them together if at all possible. Gently popping each of the windows from the outside, before prising the bottom of the inner frame, carefully breaking away any of the glued bits, which in my case offered little resistance. Then the whole section can be lifted up and out, hopefully as a single unit. But again, it doesn't really matter if some bits snap off. They can be removed separately, pushing the panes in from the outside, then prising up and out of the retaining lugs on the inside, until all of the side windows are removed, either to be replaced by blanks or refitted when paintwork is done. And just to make sure they all go back in the right places, I've laid out the strips in the correct order while we wait. Now for a dry run, just to make sure everything fits, starting with the two plain blanks just behind the cab. The first is a little bit stubborn, but it soon clicks into place. The second, quite a bit looser, but will be fine when glued. Next will be one of the windows, followed by the generator vents, both fitting easily, but snug enough not to fall out. And for the first time, it's starting to feel like our inspection train is coming together. But it's the repaint that will really make the difference. And the first question for that is just how much prep we're going to need to do, so that the old livery doesn't show through. Hoping for the best, I've got a test area with one of the northern logos, onto which I'm airbrushing some grey acrylic, building up the layers to see if we get any ghostly show-through from the original print. And the results are looking positive, the logo disappearing nicely, without, as I thought it might, leaving a slightly raised silhouette, so mercifully we can just paint over the original. Now it's time to wade in and start fitting our body parts in earnest. First the window blanks, making sure that lip is at the top, so they angle flush with the window surround. Pressing in first and then adding a bit of glue from behind, which will seep into the gap. This is really just to hold everything in place, rather than creating a really strong bond, so just a couple of drops of glue is plenty. As you can see, I've wiped off most of the acrylic paint from my test area, and it's the blanks for that side I'm fitting next. There's still a little bit of the paint left in the inside of the frame, which makes for a slightly tighter fit, but there's no harm in that. It just means our glue has to do even less work. But just to make sure our window doesn't fall out, I'm adding a drop or two to the top. Then with the plain ones at that end in place, onto the generator vents. These fit in exactly the same way, but first a drop of glue on the back of the frames, which will seep into the gap, making them totally secure, although the tight fit will almost certainly be enough. I've yet to try the Revel glue on larger 3D prints, so I don't know quite how strong it can be, but it's certainly enough to hold everything in place here, and it's much easier to work with than super glue or something like that. At the other end we've got one more blank to fit. Actually there are two, but somehow I managed to miscount. I'll have to address that later. So with nearly all blanks in place, that's the bulk of the body modifications done, and we can prepare for painting, which as I'm airbrushing means reaching for the masking tape. The yellow ends will receive a bit of attention later on, changing the numbers and adding the cameras, but mostly they'll stay unchanged, so we need to cover them up. Rather than using a chunky household masking tape, I've got some specialist modeller's stuff with a nice crisp edge, and being relatively narrow it's easy to build up, matching the contours of the body, overlapping each piece so there's no danger of any spray getting through, and not forgetting the inside. We don't want any overspray there either, ending up with a nicely wrapped cocoon. Most of the masking can be done with the edge of the tape itself, but there are a couple of places that need a bit of extra cutting, just making sure it's the tape we're cutting through and not the bodywork. There are also several details on the sides of the body that we want to preserve. The door controls can be covered over with a small piece of tape and then trimmed with our scalpel. Fortunately the tape is sufficiently see-through to find the edges, and the shape simple enough for some straight cuts, short enough to do freehand without needing a ruler. A brand new blade is essential to make sure it's just the tape we're cutting through, and for tidying up any corners. Next up are the orange lights halfway down the body, the ones that will light up when the doors are open. These wouldn't be difficult to repaint, but masking them off now will save us a job later. Then we've got the light on the other side and 3 more door controls to do. If you're nervous about using the blade directly on the plastic, you can always measure up and cut the rectangles away from the model, applying them ready trimmed. But however you do it, just be patient and take your time, as all what seems to be laborious preparation will pay off in the end, ultimately saving time. Looking around the body, there's one last thing I want to mask off, the little black vent. This really would be easy to repaint later, but masking it off now will prevent the layers of paint, the primer, top coat and the new black, building up in the grille and obscuring the detail. With all the little bits masked, we finally come to the roof line, which is quite a bit higher than it is on the northern livery, so I can't just use the original paintwork as a guide like I did with the yellow ends. And instead I'm making my own guide, running a strip of masking tape along the side, about 1mm away from the gutter. It's along this edge that we can apply the mask itself, carefully butting up the sides of the tape, so they fit exactly without any gap in between, giving us a nice straight edge. Inevitably there will be a certain amount of adjustment required, so just carefully pull back a little bit of the tape and reapply, until you're happy with the entire section. Then smooth down the length of the tape, ensuring it's properly adhered. Finally running a fingernail along under the gutter before peeling back the guide, making sure we don't accidentally disturb any of the other masking. You could of course do the entire length of the roof with one single piece of tape, but it's a little bit more difficult to control, so I much prefer to do this in sections, just making sure the overlaps are perfectly aligned, and with one side done, we can go on to the other. As with the ends, let's not forget the insides, and I'm running some tape behind the windows. Not so much to prevent the overspray affecting the interior, more so we don't get the paint coming in one side and out through the windows on the other. And that's our masking complete, leaving exposed only the bits we want the paint to go on, with any areas at risk of overspray also covered up. Now we can get on with painting, and first of all a layer of primer, and I'm using a matte enamel, which should give us a more robust finish than the acrylic I used for the test. This will provide a good foundation for the top coat, as well as covering up the original livery and blending in our window blanks, showing up any bits that will need a bit of filler before the top coat, which having left everything to dry overnight, we come to now. As far as I know, the pale blue livery is unique to the Class 153 inspection trains, and nobody manufactures an exact match, so I'm going to have to mix my own, and I think a combination of these two is going to get me pretty close. So mixing jar at the ready, it's time to get the lids off and give them a good stir, not just to smooth out the mix, but also to ensure the pigment is evenly distributed. The colours I'm using are from the Revell range. Number 49, a light blue with a hint of green, and 50, a mid blue, and my guess is a half and half mix of each will be about right. Without having the actual train in front of me, estimating the colour is actually quite difficult. Any reference photos will be affected by the lighting conditions, as well as looking very different when backlit on a computer screen. So taking a broad average combined with a bit of colour theory learnt from art school, I'm making a pretty educated guess, starting with 2 pipettes of each colour, attempting to suck up the same amount of paint each time, squeezing out as much as possible. My precise volumes don't have to be amazingly accurate. It's more a case of monitoring how much of each I'm using, so I can adjust the mix later on, adding a considered amount of one or the other, testing as I go. And with half of the pale blue mixed in, let's see how that compares to the unmixed colours, just to check that we're on the right track, brushing out a little bit on a piece of coated paper, so it doesn't sink in. This confirms that we do need to push it a bit more towards the pale blue, so in with the second pipette as planned, giving us a roughly 50-50 split. Then time to stir in well, ensuring our colours are properly mixed. Now we need to thin our mixture to a consistency suitable for airbrushing, using an appropriate solvent. The downside of enamels is that these solvents can be pretty noxious, so it's very important to read the instructions and take heed of any of the warnings, getting that lid on as soon as we're done. The amount we need is fairly inexact, depending on which particular airbrush you're using, but we're looking for a milky consistency, similar to single cream. And with all that mixed in and shaken well, time to test using the airbrush, spraying onto our sheet of coated paper, building up the layers until we've got a good even coverage, deliberately going along the edge of the paper so we can test it against my drawing, which I'm reasonably confident is close to the colour we need. And whilst the match is pretty good, I think we need to push it a little bit towards the mid-blue, adding another pipette of the number 50, giving us a rough ratio of 3:2. Then a really good shake to make sure that's all mixed in properly, before another test spray, using the same piece of paper. So even before we check against the drawing, we can see that we're getting a bit more baby blue and a little less turquoise. And now I think the balance is about right, so time to get spraying the loco, although I have mixed up quite a bit more paint using the same proportions, so we don't run out. As you can see, I've done a bit of filling around the window blanks, just to reduce the gap as much as possible. For this I used Vallejo plastic putty, brushed into the crack, and lightly feathered into the body. I actually found this painted over really well without further priming, just making sure I got an even coat of paint over it all, and gradually building up the layers, a good consistent colour and even gloss for the finish, especially after a second coat when the first one was completely dry. And I'm really happy with the colour, which definitely passes the daylight test. So having patiently waited for everything to dry completely, time for the great unmasking, peeling back all the tape, revealing the fresh paint job in all its glory. We will be coming back to paint bits of the ends later, including taking the yellow over the roof lip and around the window frames, so that will also give me a chance to tidy up any bits I'm not completely happy with. Then with a simple flick of the tip of a scalpel blade, we can unmask all those little details we spent so much time covering up. Now we can begin putting things back together, starting with the windows, and you can see I've already separated out the bits we need, either snapping the flexible connectors or cutting with a razor saw. The cab windows go in easily, and like with the window blanks, just a drop of glue will hold them in place. Then we have the single window. This was already separate for some reason, and was the one I measured up for the CAD. This is a slightly tighter fit, as the paint has built up on the inside of the frame during spraying, but with a bit of firm pressure, it pushes into place, tight enough not to need any glue. Then we have the generator vents, followed by a bank of 5 windows, although it should actually be 4, as I completely miscounted the number of blanks required for that end. Even at this stage I hadn't noticed, so blundered on regardless, although even if I had, the remedy would have been the same, printing, sanding and painting another blank to replace the 5th window, hoping it will blend in, even though it hadn't been painted with the rest of the body. You'll see how I got on right at the end of the video. A rather lame excuse for my confusion is the number of window blanks has changed over the years as the units have evolved, with the other side initially sporting a full set of windows, and only the current configuration having the window blanks where the racks of computer equipment are on the inside. But even then we have a run of 9 windows, and fortunately this is one of the bits that did stay together during removal, so we can put it back in all as one piece. Again, the slight build-up of paint on the inside of the window frames during spraying makes for a slightly tight fit, but making sure they're pushed right to the top, they can be pressed in, with a bit of firm pressure from behind. They should be fine to stay in place by themselves, but a few strategic drops of glue at each end and one in the middle will ensure they're fixed properly, and won't accidentally pop out. Then for now, we need to refit the cab, again gently flexing the body sides, and fitting the tabs into the slots on the glazing, and not forgetting the light insulation strip. We'll actually be taking the cab out again later on for repainting the yellow ends, so the refit is mostly so we don't lose anything or forget how it all goes back together. So I'm just applying a couple of tiny drops of glue to hold it in place for now. With the window blanks done and the body painted, our inspection train is starting to look the business. But the next step will make all the difference, and that's the decals, which I've designed and printed myself. In some other videos I share how to do this, covering general methods and techniques, so I won't go through everything here, but I will cover all the pertinent bits for this project. The first issue is we need white lettering and logos, and my printer doesn't do white, so we're going to have to print the background, matching the blue of the paintwork, and my first sheet of decal paper includes some test swatches. I've already sourced the logos I need and worked out which font they use, so now I need to get the colour right, and the only way to do that is to try out some variations, tweaking the balance of cyan and yellow in my colour mix. 75-15 is my control. That's the one I used on my illustration, so we'll find out how close my paint mix is, as it's now to that we want to match. Ultimately, we want to float off our decals onto the surface, but we can get a pretty good early indication just by holding up the cut edge of our bracketed swatches. First the 80% cyan with different amounts of yellow, then various combinations with 5% increments, finishing up much paler with more of the white paper showing through. Then after the initial appraisal, we can pick a couple of candidates to get onto the surface, snipping out their corresponding halves and floating on our saucer of water. For this project I'm using a laser printer rather than the water-soluble inkjet, so there's no need to seal the print layer. But the surface is quite delicate and vulnerable to scratching, so when it comes to the real thing, I will be using a fine coat of acrylic varnish. But that shouldn't affect the colour, which we can clearly see at the moment is far too dark. That was the 80% cyan, so we're obviously going to need something from the other end of the scale, perhaps one of the 65%. So in with another swatch, and when it's loosened from the backing sheet, we can slide it onto the surface. Now that's a whole lot closer, and we can go ahead with 65% cyan, 10% yellow, and print our decals with that. The design is actually pretty straightforward, but I won't go into it in any detail here, other than to say you can download it from my website and print out the PDF yourself, with either an inkjet or laser printer, using the appropriate paper for each. For inkjet you will need to seal the surface, to prevent the water-soluble inks from running. But even though I'm using a laser printer, I'm airbrushing a thin coat of clear acrylic anyway, to protect the delicate surface when cutting, and as usual I'm going to treat myself to a fresh scalpel blade, before cutting along just inside the design. Even with the varnish, the print layer is still prone to cracking, so I'm not cutting right through the paper, just deep enough to cut through the decal surface, which is thin enough so we won't see any of the white edge. Then when we've cut through the surface on the other side, we can separate the entire strip from the rest of the decal paper. You'll see I've given myself plenty of duplicates, just in case I mess anything up. My design has all the elements correctly spaced for the entire length, so I could apply the whole thing in one go. But that would be quite unwieldy, so I've opted to do it in sections, starting with the type for the left-hand side, and checking my drawing for the precise position I can pop my first bit of decal into the water. With all the rivets, the bodywork is actually quite uneven, so to give my decal the best chance of sticking, I'm going to apply a bit of decal fix, just brushing it onto the area where it's going to go. This is another good reason not to try and do it all in one go, as we don't want it to dry out before we get there with the decal. That still has the white film either side of the design, so we can float that off, dragging it away with a fingernail, leaving just the bit we want on the backing paper, ready to apply to the model, sliding the paper away from under the decal. You can see even with a short length like this, it's quite difficult to get it in exactly the right place, but the position can be easily adjusted with a soft paintbrush, and the thin film flattened to the surface, further assisted by a bit of decal softener, brushed on with a cotton bud just to press it into the rivets, getting it as flat as we possibly can. Not quite up to the standards of the original livery, but pretty good for homemade. It'll be even better when dry. Then we can go on with the next section, and I'm going to do 3 of the logos. I could just butt my strip up to the end of the first one, but I've decided to leave a gap in between to minimise the amount of background, and using the snipped off end as a spacer, it's into the water with my decal. And while that's loosening up from the backing sheet, I can brush the target area with decal fix, ready for application, not forgetting to remove the unwanted white film from either side. Then onto the model in exactly the same way as before, the spacer ensuring we get it in the right place. Although the windows are also a pretty good guide. That was largely how I worked out the original positions anyway. Then with our spacer's job done, we can flick it out of the way and discard it, tweaking the final position with our soft brush, ensuring the top is level with the other one. Then once again treatment with the setting solution, paying particular attention to the rivets, pushing the film down with the tip of the cotton bud. And when that's done, we're on to the next bit. But I think you've got the general idea, so I'll skip ahead to the last bit, at least for this side, leaving everything to set overnight before going on to the other, which is much the same, although some of the elements are in a different order, and the spacing is slightly different. Now we come to the distinctive cameras, and perhaps the most challenging part of the build. Like the decals, this involved a lot of research, both into what they look like, but also how to create the complex shapes in Tinkercad, as well as actually getting them to print, with enough fine detail to make them convincing. And like the decals, all the files are on the website. The front camera prints as a single piece, and just needs a bit of tidying up, particularly around the camera hood, which my budget ender actually did surprisingly well to reproduce. The ones at what I still think of as the back, even though it's actually the one with the internal camera, are rather more complicated, as I really wanted to keep that downward angle, so each has its own bracket. Again, I was properly impressed how the ender handled these, with only a little bit of cleanup required, mostly at the ends of the brackets. The only real difficulty being just how small they are, and the tendency for them to ping across the cutting mat, but I managed not to lose any of the bits. Unsurprisingly, the big camera goes in the big bracket, tilting down slightly, with a smaller bracket for the top camera. This needs a similar cleanup, as does the camera itself, just shaving a little bit off the side so it'll fit, perhaps a little bit more later on, to make an allowance for when it's painted, which I'll be doing unassembled, so the paint can get on the inside of the brackets, and we'll be coming to that as part of the next section, which is adapting the paintwork for the yellow ends, and for this I need to pop out the front windows, then referring back to my reference photos, start masking off the areas that need painting. Unlike the northern livery, the yellow comes over the lip of the roof, so that's where I'm starting, leaving a similar margin to the sides of the cab. This is on a curve and a slope, so needs to be made up of several strips, adjusting for the contours. Really, it would have made more sense to do this before the decals, but I wanted to get them on for the filming of part 1 and for the trailer for this video, so in fact I'd only got to this point in the project when they were first posted, so I hope that explains why there's been a bit of a wait for part 2. As I mentioned earlier, I can also use this bit of the respray to adjust any bits of the first I wasn't completely happy with, including this side of the cab, where a bit of the blue crept under the masking, so I can just tidy that up by overspraying with yellow, along with the rest of the end. As well as the roofline, the window frames also need painting, and the numbers covered, but I'm not going to do the carriage connector door, so I can mask off all of that, getting tape around the concertina cowl, a task made rather more difficult by the lamp iron, requiring some thin strips of tape tucked around the back, covering up all the bits we want to remain black. Then with all the fiddly bits done, we can seal off the entire carriage connector, folding around the tape to form a parcel, so no paint will get through. Then we need to cover the lights, trimming a little bit of tape on the cutting mat and sticking on the front, pushing in around the step. Then once again, we mustn't forget the windows, masking tape on the inside, so no spray gets through. I'd hoped to be able to remove the windscreen wipers, but at this end at least they seem to be firmly stuck, so they'll have to be painted along with everything else, and repainted later. The other end needs the same treatment, and with cab popped out once again and windows removed, we can mask the roof, the sides, carriage connector and the lights, not forgetting the inside of the windows, until that end too is safely wrapped up. Then we can cover the rest of the body, and as I don't want my decals pulled off by masking tape, I'm giving it a loose wrap of tracing paper sealed at the ends. I probably should do underneath as well, but I'll be spraying it flat on the table, so I don't think there will be any risk of spray getting through. But I have taped it up under the edges of the body to make sure it's properly sealed. This time I have gotten off the shelf paint, so no colour mixing required, just thinning to a suitable consistency for airbrushing, and being pale, lots of coats are needed, allowing them to dry in between. At the same time, I want to paint my cameras, and so they don't get blown all over the place by the airbrush, I'm sticking them on a bit of double-sided tape, backs of the brackets downwards, having trimmed off any unwanted flash. As with the cabs, I want to build up the layers gradually, so the paint doesn't pool on the surface, where it could become thick and goopy, preventing our parts fitting together properly. And after a bit of patience, I've got a nice even yellow on all the parts of the cameras, and after a final coat on both cabs as well. When our paint is dry, we've got one last task on one end, which is to increase the black area around the headlights, and having untaped just the bottom of the carriage connector, I can mask off the rest of the yellow, little bits at a time, making sure I get my tape right down into any creases, with no chance of the black paint getting onto any bits that we don't want it to. We mustn't forget the lenses of the lights themselves, covering them with a small rectangle of tape, pre-cut on our cutting mat, fitting just inside the yellow frame. Then making absolutely sure the rest of the yellow is all covered up, and making any final adjustments. We can airbrush, this time using a black acrylic, just making sure it gets into all the nooks and crannies. I've got some painting to do on the cameras too, the cable trunking, and this is very definitely a job for the brush, and a pretty fine one too, just making sure we get our black enamel right up to, but not over the edge of the camera. It helps that they're still stuck down to the surface, but to get to all the edges we are going to have to pick them up, just for the finishing touches. And while we've got the black paint out, we can repaint the wipers, sliding in a bit of aluminium foil behind, so we don't get any black on our freshly painted yellow. Then we have one last job before we put the airbrush away, masking and painting the orange Cantrail stripes, a bit of a mission in its own right, and one, as usual, where patience pays a dividend. Spending that extra time getting our masks straight and evenly spaced, then gradually building up the orange paint so it doesn't creep under the tape, giving us a fuzzy edge, and not rushing the unmasking, making sure our paint is fully dry before revealing the fruits of our labour. Rushing and messing up now would be such a shame, but I'm pretty happy with that. As with some of the side ones, the cab windows needed a little persuasion to refit, the paint having built up on the insides of the frames. And refitting the wipers on the end that I could get them off proved really quite tricky, requiring my finest tweezers. I'm not sure which is more difficult, leaving them on to be repainted or removing during the process and replacing afterwards. But in this project I'm getting used to dealing with the miniature, and it's time to fit the cameras. I had tried painting the lenses, but even with the finest brush the results were horrible. So instead I've got a piece of black insulating tape stuck to my work surface, from which I'm cutting tiny rectangles, and with yet another brand new 10A scalpel blade, very carefully manoeuvring them into place and sticking them down. Once again checking with our reference photos for the size, shape and relative position of each, further trimming if necessary. Then when completely happy, time to get them on the model, applying a very tiny amount of superglue, both onto the door and the back of the camera, and again with my finest tweezers and the steadiest hand I could manage, stick the first one into place, making sure it's straight and in the middle. Then it's assembly time for the two cameras at the other end. Again, just the tiniest bit of superglue on the inside of the bracket, applied with the tip of a cocktail stick, and then bravely in with the camera itself, adjusting the position and the angle before the glue sets. Although even with supposedly instant superglue, you have got a bit of time for this, and also when it comes to fitting it on the train. Then the same deal with the top camera, only smaller. A tiny bit of glue on the inside of the bracket, and then in with the camera, angling it down slightly, steadying it with the cable conduit, and pushing it home with the thumbnail, before attaching to the logo, again with a spot of glue on the door, and the tiniest amount on the back of the bracket. You must forgive my blurry camera work here, but once in place and adjusted, I was able to refocus to show the final position, slightly to the left of centre. And that just about finishes the bodywork. We've got our reconfigured windows, brand new livery with homemade decals, and the repainted ends with tiny cameras. I've also rectified my mistake miscounting the number of windows by adding in a new blank. Then for me, the star of the show, the 3D printed generator vents. Then it's time to reunite with the chassis, which we haven't seen for a while. In that time, I've done a bit of work, including brush painting the lower body bits at either end, and I've just tidied up the internal components, the Raspberry Pi Zero, the Adafruit Power Boost, and the lithium battery. I've also rebuilt my voltage regulator, tidying up the connection with the bridge rectifier, and found a new location on a 3D printed shelf, just fitting behind the cab. Then there's the 3D printed interior, and after much trial and error, adjusting the shapes around the components and trying to work out exactly where the internal equipment should be, I've just about got something I'm happy with. There's still a bit more work to do, adding some seats from the original interior and giving it a paint, but I've rather run out of time to include it here, so I'm just fitting the basic version. If you want to find out what the finished thing ends up like, why not follow me on Blue Sky? And of course, all the files will be on the website. Then it's back on with the body, gently lowering it over all the internal components, a fit that's sometimes quite tight, and our network rail Class 153 inspection train is just about complete. But I've got one final job, and that's to renumber the ends. I'd planned to make my own transparent sheet of decals for this, but right at the end of the project I found these, a sheet of Rail Tech transfers. They're only for the first iteration of the livery, so can't replace all of my side decals, but I can use them for the numbers at the ends. And it's these that I'm cutting out of the sheet, very carefully floating off onto the surface of my water, and retrieving when ready, to be applied, gently guiding into place with the tip of a soft brush. Not a job for the faint-hearted, as they're very delicate. It took me several attempts, but I finally got there in the end. The finishing touches to an extremely satisfying project, even without the internal electronics. But they, I think, are what sets it apart. A real working model, in every sense a facsimile inspection train, monitoring the track of my model railway, while really looking the part. The perfect addition to anyone's fleet, and an enormously enjoyable build, especially with the onboard video.